I never expected Christmas dinner to change everything. At 73 years old, I thought I'd seen all the surprises life had to offer. I'd buried 3 people I loved, survived a marriage that crumbled like old paper, and made peace with being the kind of grandfather that children know exists, but don't really know. So when my daughter invited me to her house in Connecticut that December 24th, I said yes out of obligation, not hope. The drive from Manhattan took 3 hours. I'd moved into that cramped studio apartment in Washington Heights after the divorce, a place that smelled of the previous tenants cooking and had radiators that either screamed or refused to work entirely. No middle ground. I'd made a life of sorts, quiet, small, the kind of life you build when you've run out of chances to build something bigger. The car was an old Honda Civic, silver paint dulling to gray. My hands gripped the steering wheel the whole way, knuckles white despite the heating system blasting warm air that made me drowsy. Route 95 North stretched out endlessly, the world frozen and colorless in that December way. New England winters have a particular meanness to them, I've always thought. They don't just freeze things, they seem to freeze the possibility of warmth itself. Sarah's house was the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Colonial style, white shutters, a long driveway lined with winter shrubs. Lights twinkled around the front door and along the gutters. The lawn stretched out smooth and green despite the cold, maintained by some landscaping company that her husband Todd probably paid a fortune for every month. Behind the house, I could see the trees of the property line, lots of land, the kind of space that said, "We are doing well." I'd never been entirely comfortable here. Sarah came to the door before I'd even made it to the porch. She was wearing a green sweater dress, her dark hair, my hair, the color I used to have before it all went gray, pulled back in a neat bun. At 48 years old, she'd cultivated a look of controlled grace. Everything about her was managed, her appearance, her tone of voice, the expressions that crossed her face. "Dad," she embraced me, and I smelled the expensive perfume she always wore, something with notes of jasmine and sandalwood. "We are so glad you made it." "Wouldn't miss it," I said, though we both knew that wasn't entirely true. I'd missed the last 2 Christmas dinners for reasons that barely mattered anymore. Inside, the house was warm and smelled like rosemary and roasting turkey. A fire crackled in the living room fireplace, and the tree, a real Douglas fir, probably 12 feet tall, dominated the corner, covered in gold and silver ornaments and white lights. Sarah's husband Todd stood by the fire with a glass of something amber-colored. Their 2 kids, Jennifer, 22, and Marcus, 9, were somewhere in the house. I could hear Marcus's high voice coming from upstairs, where he was presumably being kept occupied until dinner was ready. "Let me take your coat," Sarah said, already reaching for the sleeve of my old wool overcoat, the black one I'd had for 15 years. Todd extended his hand. "David, good to see you. Drink." "Just water, thanks." Todd's smile didn't waver. He was a man made of the kind of composure that comes from never having really struggled. Tall, graying handsomely at the temples, with the ease of someone who belongs in rooms like this. He worked in finance. I was never entirely clear on what that meant, except that it meant he made a lot of money. Sarah guided me to the living room, and we made small talk about the drive, about the weather, about the house. The conversation drifted in the way family conversations do when there's not much real substance to say. I asked about her work. She's a senior marketing director at a pharmaceutical company, and she gave me the abbreviated version. Todd said something about the market and interest rates. Jennifer came down for a moment, gave me an awkward hug, and then excused herself to take a call from a friend. Then Sarah said, "Come meet Marcus properly. He's been looking forward to seeing you." The thing about Marcus was that he didn't speak. He hadn't since he was 4 years old, after some kind of episode that no one ever fully explained to me. Sarah had been cagey about it in the few conversations we'd had about it. There had been something at preschool, she'd said. He'd gotten scared. The doctors said it was selective mutism, that he could speak but chose not to, that there wasn't anything physically wrong with him. The implication was always that he would grow out of it, but he was 9 now, and he still hadn't. I'd seen him maybe 5 times in his life. He was a beautiful kid, quiet, pale, with Sarah's dark eyes, but Todd's fine features. He moved through the world with a kind of careful precision, as though everything might break if he wasn't gentle enough. When we went upstairs to the playroom, he was sitting on the floor with a drawing pad in front of him, colored pencils scattered around him like he'd been working in a frantic burst and then had to stop. When he heard us enter, he looked up. Our eyes met for just a moment, and I saw something in his expression that I couldn't quite name. Recognition, maybe, or maybe I was projecting. "Marcus, this is your grandfather," Sarah said, the way she might introduce him to anyone. "David, this is Marcus." He looked back at his drawing, his shoulders tensing slightly. "What are you working on?" I asked. For a long moment, he didn't respond. Sarah said, "He likes to draw, he's very talented." Marcus's hand moved, turning the pad slightly away from us, protective. The message was clear, he didn't want it seen, not yet, not by me. "That's fine," I said. "I remember when I used to draw too." It wasn't true exactly, I'd never been an artist, but I'd done a lot of sketching when I was young, back in those days before everything fell apart, before decisions were made that echoed through decades. I'd been good at it once, reasonable hands, a sense of proportion. I'd given it up, like most things in my life, and I'd never picked it back up. Sarah left us there, saying she needed to finish preparing dinner. Marcus and I sat in an awkward silence, him with his drawing pad, me on the edge of a child-sized table that I was too large for, my knees practically up to my chest. After a few minutes, I excused myself and went downstairs. The afternoon stretched out in that slow, leaden way that family visits do. I helped Sarah prepare vegetables, though I suspect she would have preferred I stay out of the kitchen. Todd opened a bottle of wine and drank steadily. Jennifer returned and disappeared again. The house filled with the smells of Christmas dinner. Outside, the sun sank toward the horizon in a cascade of pink and orange light that seemed false, too beautiful for a world that contained so much ordinary sadness. At 6 o'clock, we sat down to eat. The table was long and polished, set with real china and cloth napkins and glasses that cost more than my rent. Sarah had prepared everything well. The turkey was golden and moist, the stuffing was seasoned perfectly, the gravy was smooth and rich. She'd made all the things that are supposed to matter on Christmas Day. We passed dishes around and made the appropriate compliments and ate in a way that was peaceful, if not warm. Marcus sat at the table too, eating quietly, moving his food around on his plate in a way that suggested he was thinking about something else entirely. Jennifer was mostly on her phone, barely visible beneath her blonde hair. Todd dominated the conversation, talking about a deal he'd worked on, making jokes that I didn't quite understand. Sarah laughed when appropriate and asked him questions that allowed him to continue talking. I ate my turkey and said almost nothing. When we were mostly finished, Sarah stood to clear plates, and I offered to help. As I stood, something brushed against my leg. I looked down and found Marcus standing beside me, looking up. In his right hand, he held a folded piece of paper. Without saying a word, of course, without saying a word, he held it out to me. I took it, and he turned and left the room, moving silently the way he moved through everything, like he was trying not to disturb the air around him. "What did he give you?" Sarah asked, returning to the table. "Just a drawing, I think," I said, unfolding it. It was a pencil sketch, rendered in careful, precise lines. It showed a cabin, old, wooden, with a particular style of construction that I recognized immediately. The roof was slanted, the porch was supported by rough-hewn beams, and the chimney was built from dark stone. There was a window in the front, shuttered, and a door beside it. Around the cabin, he'd sketched mountains, their peaks sharp and angular against a blank sky. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. "Is that nice?" Sarah asked, coming around the table to look. I couldn't answer immediately. The room had started to spin slightly, or that's how it felt, though I knew the room was perfectly still. "David," Sarah was looking at me now with something like concern. "Are you all right?" "This cabin," I said slowly, my voice barely steady. "Where did he see it?" "I don't know," Sarah said. "He probably just drew it from his imagination. He does that sometimes, just draws things." But my hands were shaking as I looked at the drawing again. The details were too specific to be imagination. The way the cabin was built, the the shape of the porch railing, the stones in the chimney, it was all precisely rendered. It was like looking at a photograph, except in pencil, except executed with the careful hand of a 9-year-old boy. "Sarah," I said, and I'm not sure what my voice sounded like, but it made her step back slightly. "This cabin, have you seen it? Has anyone shown Marcus a picture of it?" "I don't think so," she said, and now she looked confused and a little worried. "Why, what does it matter where he got the idea?" "It matters," I said, "because I know this cabin, this exact cabin." "What do you mean?" I looked at my daughter, at her controlled expression, at the careful way she was holding her body. "This is the cabin," I said slowly, "where your Uncle Michael disappeared." For a moment, we just stood there in her beautiful dining room in Connecticut, surrounded by the remnants of Christmas dinner, the drawing trembling in my hands. "That's not possible," Sarah said quietly. But I knew it was. I knew the shape of that cabin the way you know your own face. I knew it because I'd been there all those years ago in the summer of 1998, when my brother Michael had gone into those mountains and never come back. Part 2, The Lie. I need to tell you about Michael before I can explain what happened next. Michael was my younger brother by 4 years. Where I was careful and cautious, he was wild and careless. Where I kept my feelings locked inside, he wore his on the surface, and everyone always knew exactly what he was thinking. He was beautiful in a way that I never was, blonde where I was brown, with a kind of easy confidence that people responded to. People always wanted to be around Michael. My parents, especially my mother, doted on him. They could barely see me when Michael was in the room, and I accepted this. I was the kind of person who accepted things. I adjusted myself to fit the shape of what was already there. Michael had big dreams. He wanted to be a writer, he said, though he never actually wrote much. He wanted to live in California, or maybe Colorado, somewhere wild and free and unconstrained. He talked about it constantly. He was going to move out west, he said, and he was going to become a better version of himself, someone who did important things and made a mark on the world. It was the kind of dream that lots of young men have, and most of them don't pursue them. But Michael did, sort of. In 1998, when he was 29 years old, he'd saved enough money from his job as a carpenter to take an extended trip to Colorado. He was going to spend the summer there, he said, staying in a cabin that he'd rented. He was going to write his book. He was going to figure out what he wanted to do with his life. He was going to reinvent himself. He asked me to come with him. I was 33 at the time, already in my marriage to Rebecca, though the marriage was already showing signs of strain. Rebecca didn't like Michael. She found him chaotic and irresponsible, and the thought of spending a summer away from her with my brother while he tried to find himself didn't appeal to me. I turned him down. He went alone in June, driving out in a beat-up Toyota truck with a cooler and a backpack and the kind of unfounded optimism that seems like a birthright for people like Michael. He said he'd be back at the end of August. He said we'd see each other in the fall. He never came back. What happened was this. Michael had been living in that cabin, alone, for about 6 weeks. Sometime in late July, something changed. Whether it was psychological, whether he'd been using drugs, whether he'd just decided he didn't want to continue living, none of this was ever determined with certainty. He walked out of that cabin, up into the mountains, and he disappeared. They found the cabin empty when the rental company sent someone to check on it. They found a note. I never saw the note, but the police said it was vague, just some rambling thoughts, nothing that indicated intent, but nothing that ruled it out either. They found his truck parked outside, his belongings inside, his personal things scattered around like he'd just stepped out. They organized a search. Helicopters, dogs, volunteers from the surrounding towns. They searched for 3 weeks. They dragged the lakes. They combed the mountainside. They found nothing. After 3 weeks, they called off the official search. The general consensus was that he'd either killed himself, there were hints of depression in his things, a journal where he'd written about feeling isolated and lost, or he'd just wandered off and gotten lost, which amounted to the same thing in the end. They never found his body. They never found any definitive proof of anything. He was simply gone. My parents, especially my mother, couldn't accept it. She spent the next 15 years trying to find him, hiring private investigators, driving to Colorado to search, following up on every possible lead. She'd be convinced that he was living in some commune in New Mexico, or that he was working in Alaska under a fake name, or that he was actually alive somewhere and had chosen to disappear. It consumed her. It took my father's focus away from her too, as he tried to manage her obsession. The rest of our family became secondary to the question of Michael. In the end, even my mother had to accept that he was gone. She stopped searching. She stopped talking about him. And then, in 2002, she had a stroke that left her partially paralyzed, and 2 years later she died. My father followed her about 6 months later, as if he couldn't quite figure out how to live without her to manage. By 2005, Michael had been gone for 7 years, and my parents were both dead. The rest of us, me, Sarah, our Aunt Carol, we did what families do. We mourned, we moved on, we didn't talk about it much anymore. And gradually, the story of Michael's disappearance became something we didn't talk about at all. We certainly didn't tell Sarah's children about it, and to my knowledge, none of us had ever shown Sarah, let alone Marcus, any pictures of the cabin where Michael had last been seen. So on Christmas night in 2024, holding a drawing that depicted that cabin with impossible accuracy, I had to confront the fact that something didn't add up. After Sarah and I had that initial exchange about the drawing, I folded it carefully and put it in my jacket pocket. We finished dinner in a kind of stunned silence. Todd kept talking, oblivious. Jennifer remained upstairs. Marcus didn't come back to the table. I stayed for dessert, a beautiful tiramisu that Sarah had made, and then, after tea, I made an excuse about needing to get back to the city. Sarah didn't push me to stay, and I think we were both relieved to have a reason to extract ourselves from the moment. "I'll walk you out," she said, and we moved through her beautiful house and into the entryway where I retrieved my old coat. "The drawing," I said before I left, "I'd like to take it if that's all right." "Of course," she said quickly, too quickly. "Has Marcus ever mentioned that cabin, ever said anything about it?" "No," she said, and now she wasn't meeting my eyes. "Not that I know of. Todd would probably remember if Marcus had." But that wasn't true. Todd wouldn't remember. Todd barely noticed Marcus at all, had never been the kind of father who paid attention to the details of his children's lives. That was Sarah's domain. "I want to talk to him about it," I said. "Tomorrow, maybe. Do you think that would be all right?" "I don't think Marcus will talk about it," Sarah said carefully. "He doesn't talk about things." "He doesn't talk at all," I corrected, and maybe there was an edge to my voice. "No," she agreed, "he doesn't." I drove back to Manhattan through the dark, the drawing on the passenger seat of my car where I could see it in the glow of the dashboard lights. And I thought about things I hadn't let myself think about in a long time. Part 3, What I'd Forgotten. I grew up in upstate New York, in a town called Whitmore, about an hour north of Albany. We lived in a big Victorian house that my parents had bought in the 60s when houses were cheap and young couples with dreams could actually afford things. It was the kind of house that required constant maintenance and was always a little too cold in the winter and too hot in the summer, but my mother loved it. She loved the high ceilings and the wraparound porch, and the way the light came through the front windows in the afternoon. Michael and I played in that house the way boys do, recklessly and without regard for the consequences. We built forts in the attic. We carved our initials into the wooden trim in the hallway, something we'd never admit to our mother. We'd sneak into the basement where our father kept his tools and his bottles of wine. My father was an electrician, a skilled one, and his hands were always marked with small burns and nicks. He smelled like copper and sweat and coffee. He was quiet, the way my mother was loud. He'd come home from work and sit in his armchair with the newspaper, and Michael and I would scatter around him, and our mother would bring him a drink, and there was a kind of peace in the house in those moments. My mother was a school teacher, English, and she had strong opinions about everything. She read voraciously and collected things, china figurines and first editions and photographs. She wanted her children to be brilliant, to accomplish great things, to make her proud. She wanted us to get out, to go to good colleges, to become the kinds of people who mattered. Michael embodied that hope in a way that I never could. He was social and charming and quick to laughter. Even as a child, he had this quality that made people gravitate toward him, and my mother saw in him the possibility of everything she wanted for her children, a kind of untethered promise. I was different. I was competent and careful and bookish. I got good grades because I worked hard, not because the material came naturally to me. I didn't have many friends. I was the kind of boy that other boys tolerated but didn't particularly like, and girls mostly didn't notice me. I was meant to be successful through sheer determination, through trying harder and being better. But there was something passive in me even then, something that made it hard to push myself, to want things badly enough. When Michael asked me to go to Colorado with him, I said no because Rebecca didn't want me to go, but also because part of me was relieved to have a reason to say no. The truth was that Michael's dreams made me uncomfortable. They made me aware of the smallness of my own aspirations. He wanted to reinvent himself, to become someone new, and what did I want? I wanted my marriage to work. I wanted my job as an accountant to be satisfying. I wanted my life to be stable and safe. These are not bad things to want, but watching Michael embrace risk and possibility and growth, while I chose stability and comfort and sameness, made me feel like I was failing at something essential, like I was choosing to become smaller instead of larger. When he disappeared, I told myself I was grieving, and I was, but I was also relieved in a way that I've never quite admitted, even to myself. His absence meant I didn't have to watch him become everything I wasn't. I didn't have to measure myself against his trajectory anymore. Now, driving back to the city on Christmas night, I realized that I'd spent 26 years not thinking about Michael, not actively avoiding thinking about him. It was less active than that. It was just that I'd allowed the days to accumulate, to pile up on top of the memory of him until he'd been buried so deep that I could almost forget he'd existed. But Marcus's drawing had pulled him out again. The next morning, I called Sarah from my apartment. It was early, maybe 7 o'clock, but I assumed she'd be awake. "It's Dad," I said when she answered. "Hi," she said, and she sounded tired. "Is everything all right?" "I need to talk to you about something," I said. "About Michael, about the cabin. I need to understand where Marcus could have possibly seen it." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Sarah, I don't think this is a good conversation to have on the phone," she said finally. "Then let me come back. Today I'll drive back." "Okay," she said, and her voice was very small. "Okay, come back." I hung up the phone and looked around my apartment. It was a studio, really, with a kitchenette and a bathroom the size of a closet and windows that looked out onto a fire escape where pigeons nested. I'd bought a few pieces of furniture, a bed, a table, a chair. I'd hung some prints on the walls, but it didn't look like a home. It looked like a waiting room, like the space someone occupies temporarily while they're in the process of transitioning between lives. I packed a bag with clean clothes and my toiletries. I showered, I made coffee, and then I drove back to Connecticut. It was a gray day, the sky low and heavy, the kind of day that feels like winter is settling in for a long occupation. Sarah's house looked different in this light, less cheerful somehow, less like a home and more like a facade. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment before going in. Sarah answered the door immediately, before I even knocked. She'd been waiting for me. "Marcus is at school," she said. "Todd took him. We have a few hours." We sat in her kitchen, which was all white cabinets and stainless steel appliances, with a window that looked out over the back lawn. Sarah made tea, and we sat at her island, and she told me something that I'd never known. "When I was 16, she began, "you were away at college. It was summer after your freshman year, and you came home for a few weeks before your summer job started. Do you remember?" I nodded. It was 1985. I'd worked as a camp counselor that summer at a day camp for kids, and it had been one of the only jobs I'd ever quit. I'd lasted 3 weeks before I realized I was terrible with children and couldn't handle the chaos. Michael was home that summer too, Sarah continued. He was 19 and he dropped out of his first college semester. Mom and Dad were upset, but Michael didn't care. He was always so sure of himself, like the rules didn't apply to him. Sarah was stirring her tea slowly, deliberately, looking at her spoon more than at me. There was something going on, she said. I didn't understand it fully at the time, but I could tell there was tension. Michael would disappear for long stretches, and Mom would get anxious. Dad would disappear too, and when he came back, they'd be in his study with the door closed, and they'd be talking in low voices. I remember being scared, thinking something was really wrong. Do you know what it was? I asked. I found out later, Sarah said. Much later. Michael had gotten a girl pregnant, someone from high school. Her parents were pressing for him to marry her or at least take responsibility for the baby. He didn't want to do either of those things. He was 19 and selfish and unprepared, and he panicked. I didn't say anything. I was watching my daughter's face as she told me this story, seeing the concentration there, the effort it was taking to say these things out loud. Mom and Dad helped him, Sarah continued. Financially, they helped him pay for the abortion. They helped him pay for it, and then they helped him disappear. They helped him move away, get a fresh start, get away from the girl and her family and all the consequences. Sarah. Let me finish, she said, holding up a hand. After that summer, he moved to California for a while. You didn't know this because you'd already left for college by then, and when you came home for Thanksgiving, Michael was gone, and Mom and Dad said he'd taken a year off to figure things out. They said he was traveling. They said he was working. They never said anything about a girl or a baby or any of it. I didn't know, I said, and I was aware of how inadequate that sounded. No one was supposed to know, Sarah said. I only found out because I was eavesdropping, and I didn't tell anyone. I was 16 years old, and I thought it was this big adult secret, and keeping it was like being initiated into something. Looking back, I realize it was just shame, our family's shame. What about the baby? I asked. I don't know, Sarah said. Michael never mentioned it again, as far as I know. The girl and her family, they moved away. By the time Michael disappeared in 1998, he'd been living his life like it had never happened, like he could just erase it. Sarah finally looked at me. But he couldn't erase it, she said, because it didn't go away, and I think that might have been part of why he was so lost when he went to Colorado. I think he was running from something even then. I sat with this for a moment, understanding the weight of what she was telling me. How does this connect to Marcus? I asked. When Marcus was 4, Sarah said, he was at a play date with another child, a girl named Emma. Emma's mother is, or rather, her mother's name was Lisa Hartwell. Does that name mean anything to you? It took me a moment, and then it clicked. Hartwell. I remembered that name from 1985, the girl's last name, though I'd tried hard to forget. I remembered my mother being worried about the Hartwell family, whether they'd try to come after Michael legally. Michael's girlfriend, I said slowly, the girl from high school. Yes, Sarah said, well, ex-girlfriend, and the baby that she had with Michael, that baby was given up for adoption. But Lisa raised Emma herself, Emma's half-sister. So Emma has a genetic connection to Michael. And somehow, when Marcus and Emma were together, there was some kind of episode. Emma said something to Marcus or showed him something, or I don't actually know what happened, but Marcus went nonverbal after that. Because Emma told him about Michael. Not exactly, Sarah said, because Emma told him that she had a half-uncle named Michael, and that Michael had a drawing of a cabin, and that Michael had carried that drawing around with him for years. Michael had given it to his girlfriend, to Lisa, Emma's mother, as a gift when he was 19 years old. He'd drawn it or found it, and he'd kept it with him. And Lisa had kept it too, all these years, and Emma had found it, and... Sarah stopped, and her hands were trembling as she picked up her tea and set it back down. Emma showed Marcus the drawing, Sarah said, and then Marcus stopped talking. And the next day, Todd and I talked to Emma's mother, Lisa, and she explained everything. The connection to Michael, Michael's drawing, and we decided not to tell you. We decided to protect you from the truth. What truth? I asked. That Michael had a baby. I wish you'd told me, I wish. No, Sarah interrupted. That's not the truth, or it's part of it, but not the important part. Then what's the important part? Sarah stood and walked to the window, her back to me, looking out at her empty lawn. Lisa knew where Michael went, she said quietly. When he disappeared, she knew because he told her where he was going. He reached out to her a few months before he went to Colorado. He wanted to know if he could see Emma, his daughter. Her name is Emma. She was 18 years old, and Lisa said yes. I felt the room start to shift around me. Michael went to Colorado to see his daughter, Sarah continued. That's what he was doing that summer, but it was too complicated. The situation was too fraught. And when Lisa found out that he was struggling, that he was depressed, that he was talking about how lost he felt, she told him not to contact Emma again. She told him that it would hurt her, that Emma had a good life, that he would only cause problems. And then he disappeared, I said. And then he disappeared, Sarah agreed. And Lisa never told the police. She never told us. She never told anyone, because she was afraid that if people knew Michael had gone there to see Emma, they'd blame her. They'd blame her for driving him away or for making things worse. So she kept it a secret. She let everyone think that Michael had just killed himself in a depressive episode, when the truth was much more complicated than that. How do you know this? I asked. Emma told Todd, Sarah said, when Emma found her mother's journal years later after Lisa had died, and Emma felt guilty. She was 9 years old when her mother told her that Michael was her half-uncle, and she thought it was her fault that Michael had gone away. She thought he'd left because of her, because her mother had told him not to contact her. Emma spent years carrying that guilt, and when she was old enough to understand what had happened, she wanted to tell someone. She wanted to tell Marcus, because she could see that something was off with him, and she thought maybe if he knew the truth, it would help somehow. But it didn't help, I said. No, Sarah said. It made things worse. Marcus went nonverbal. And that's when Todd and I made the decision to keep it from you. We thought it would be kinder. We thought you didn't need to know that Michael had gone there to see a daughter you didn't know existed, or that his last contact had been with that family, or that the truth was more complicated than anyone realized. I stood and moved to join Sarah at the window. The lawn stretched out white and frozen, empty. Did Michael know he had a daughter? I asked. Yes, Sarah said. Lisa told him when he reached out. Emma was 18. Michael wanted to meet her, but Lisa was protective and things went wrong. Michael was fragile and he left. And no one ever found him. No, Sarah said. No one ever found him. Part 4, the daughter. The revelation that Michael had a daughter, a granddaughter that I'd never known about, took the shape of a stone in my chest. It was there every moment. It was there when I woke up, and it was there when I tried to sleep. It was there during the mundane tasks of daily life, the going to the mailbox, the buying of groceries, the sitting in my apartment staring at nothing in particular. I had a niece, Michael had a child, and neither of them was alive to tell me this themselves. I decided, without really deciding, that I needed to know more. I needed to understand who this daughter was, how she had lived, what she had known about Michael, and what she thought had happened to him. Sarah gave me Lisa's address. She'd lived in Boulder, Colorado. According to Sarah, she'd died of cancer in 2019, 5 years earlier, but Emma was still alive. Emma was 27 years old. Emma lived in Denver. I found her address relatively easily once I had her name. The internet makes it possible to find almost anyone, as long as you're willing to spend a few hours scrolling through databases and social media profiles. Emma Hartwell. She was a teacher, elementary school, in a public school in Denver. Her Facebook page showed a woman who looked like she was made from a combination of features I could recognize. Michael's blonde hair, something about the cheekbones that seemed familiar, maybe something of my own genetics, somewhere in the configuration of her face. On a cold day in early January, I got in my car and I drove to Denver. It's about 20 hours of driving if you go straight, and I didn't go straight. I took my time, stopped in small towns, ate in diners, stayed in motels. The landscape changed gradually as I drove west, the flat towns and industrial areas giving way to rolling hills and then mountains. By the time I reached Colorado, I had convinced myself that this was a terrible idea and I should turn around. But I didn't. I kept driving. Emma's apartment was in a complex on the north side of Denver, a fairly nondescript group of buildings surrounded by parking lots and landscaping that hadn't been maintained well. I sat in my car for a long time before I got out. I had no plan. I had no idea what I was going to say. Eventually, I got out of the car. She answered on the second knock. She was wearing jeans and a sweater, and she had her blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, and when she saw me, she didn't immediately understand, but I watched as the recognition started to cross her face, the sense that she was seeing something familiar, someone who shouldn't be here. "Can I help you?" she said, and her voice was careful, the voice of a woman who'd learned to be cautious about opening her door to strangers. "My name is David Corenswit," I said. I'm Michael's brother." She went very still. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then she opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. Her apartment was small but carefully decorated, with plants in the windows and bookshelves overflowing with books and a few pieces of art on the walls. It looked like the home of someone who'd thought about what they wanted their space to represent. She sat on one end of her couch and gestured for me to take the chair across from it. "How did you find me?" she asked. "I found your mother's name in some old family information," I said, which wasn't exactly a lie. "And from there, it wasn't hard to find you." "Does your daughter know you're here?" "Sarah doesn't know," I said, "but she told me about you. She told me about your mother. She told me about why Michael went to Colorado." Emma nodded slowly, processing this. "I've wanted to talk to someone for a long time," she said. "About what happened, about Michael. I've carried this story for so long, and no one knows it except for me." "Your half-sister, Emma," she told Marcus, I said. "I know," Emma said, and she closed her eyes for a moment. "I've thought about that a lot. I'm not sure if it was right or wrong to tell him. I think I was angry when I did it. I was angry at my family for keeping this secret, and angry at Michael for leaving, and I wanted someone to know the truth. I wanted it to matter that he'd existed." "Tell me," I said, "tell me about Michael." So Emma told me her story. She'd found out about Michael when she was 9 years old from her mother. Her mother had sat her down in their kitchen in Boulder and explained that Emma had a half-uncle named Michael, and that Michael had been Lisa's boyfriend when she was young. She explained that Michael had wanted to meet Emma, but that it was complicated. She said that Michael had some issues that made it hard for him to be in relationships or to be a father. She said that Emma's grandmother, my mother, had helped keep things secret to protect everyone. Emma had accepted this explanation as a child accepts many things, with a kind of simple understanding that didn't require deep questioning. She knew she had a half-uncle. She knew he wasn't around. That was enough. But as she got older, she wanted to understand more. She wanted to know what had happened to Michael. Her mother was evasive about it. She said he'd gone away, that he'd been lost, that she didn't know where he was or what had happened to him. Emma got the sense that her mother felt guilty about something, that there was a weight there that her mother was carrying. And then, when Emma was 17 years old, her mother's health had started to decline. Lisa had cancer, and she was going to die, and she knew it was coming. So she called Emma into her room one afternoon, and she told her the real story. She told her about Michael calling her when Emma was 18, asking to meet her. She told her about Michael coming to Boulder, about them spending a few days together. She told her that Michael had wanted to understand Emma, to know who she was, but that the situation was too complicated, and Michael was too unstable, and Lisa was afraid that having a relationship with Michael would somehow damage Emma. So she told Michael he needed to leave. She'd told him to disappear, to get out of her family's life, to stop trying to be something that he couldn't be. And I think, Emma told me, sitting in her living room 27 years later, that I think my mother believed that telling him to leave is what caused him to do whatever he did. Whether he killed himself or just kept walking and never came back, I think my mother believed that she was responsible. I listened to this, with my hands folded in my lap, trying to keep my face neutral, trying not to let her see how badly I wanted to believe this or how much I wanted to reject it. Did Michael tell you about the cabin? I asked. Yes, Emma said. He drew it for me. He said it was a place he'd thought about for years, a place that represented something he wanted his life to be. Freedom, I think, solitude, space to think. He said that when he was younger he'd seen a picture of it and it had stuck with him and he'd been thinking about going there for years. He went there that summer after he saw me. Do you know where it is? The actual cabin? Somewhere in the San Juan Mountains, Emma said. He didn't tell me exactly where, but he said it was a place that he thought would have answers. Answers about who he was, about whether he could figure out how to live a different kind of life. I pulled out my phone and showed her the drawing that Marcus had made, the drawing of the cabin. Emma looked at it for a long time. That's exactly like the one my mother had, she said quietly. It's not the same drawing, that one's in pencil and hers was in charcoal or something, but the cabin is exactly the same. Michael drew it. I assume so, Emma said, or he sketched it and my mother kept it. I don't know the full story. We sat in silence for a moment, and then I asked her the question that had been sitting underneath all of this. Do you think he's dead? Emma looked away, out the window toward the parking lot. I think he's gone, she said. Whether that means he's dead or whether he's living somewhere else under a different name, I don't know. But the Michael that existed, the one that was my half-uncle and your brother, the one that wanted to find answers and become someone new, I think that version of him is gone. Do you think he went to the cabin to kill himself? I asked. I think he went there to figure out what he wanted to do, Emma said, and I don't think he figured it out. Part 5, The Mountain. I spent 3 more days with Emma in Denver. We talked about Michael, about her mother, about the complications of families and secrets. I learned about Emma's life, her work as a teacher, the friends she'd made in Colorado, the way she'd learned to carry the story of Michael without letting it destroy her. She gave me her mother's journal, or rather the parts of it that dealt with Michael. Lisa had written about that week when Michael came to Boulder. She'd written about his fragility, about the way he'd seemed so lost, about her fear that having a relationship with him would damage Emma. She'd written about telling him to leave, about watching him drive away, about not hearing from him again. The journal entries ended there. Lisa had never written about what happened after, whether she'd tried to find Michael, whether she'd contacted the police, whether she'd carried the guilt of what she'd done for the rest of her life. I asked Emma about that, and Emma said she didn't know. She said that her mother had shut down after Michael disappeared, had acted like it had never happened, had buried herself in work and raising Emma and trying to pretend that the whole thing had been a dream. Before I left Denver, I rented a car with 4-wheel drive, and Emma helped me research the location of the San Juan Mountains and the various cabins that might match Michael's drawing. Michael had been vague about where exactly the cabin was, but Emma remembered him saying something about a specific town, Silverton, maybe, or Array. She remembered him talking about driving through mountain passes and small towns that seemed frozen in time. I drove south and west, up into the mountains. The roads became narrower and more winding, the landscape more dramatic. It was winter, and there was snow, and the world narrowed down to just the road and the mountains and the sky. I didn't have a specific cabin in mind. I didn't even really know what I was looking for. But I drove anyway, up through the mountain passes, stopping in small towns, showing people Michael's drawing, asking if anyone recognized it. Most people I talked to didn't. A few said maybe that they'd seen something like it, but nothing concrete. I ended up in a small town called Array, nestled in a valley between mountains. It was beautiful and lonely, the kind of place that feels like it exists outside of time. There was a main street with a few buildings, a hotel that looked like it had been there for 100 years, a general store, some shops that catered to tourists in the summer. I went into the general store and I showed the drawing to the woman behind the counter, an older woman, maybe in her 60s, with gray hair and kind eyes. I'm looking for information about a cabin, I said. An old cabin, probably built a long time ago. Do you know anything about this? She looked at the drawing for a long moment, and I watched her face shift through different expressions. My God, she said, that's the Coleman cabin. The Coleman cabin. It's about 10 miles up into the mountains from here, she said. It's old, probably built in the 1920s or 1930s. It was owned by a family named Coleman, but they sold it decades ago. It's been used as a vacation rental for the past 30 years or so. Can you tell me how to get there? She gave me directions, confusing, handwritten on a piece of paper with landmarks instead of street names. I thanked her and drove back toward the mountains. It took me an hour to find the right turnoff. The road became unpaved and then barely passable, and I was grateful for the four-wheel drive. The snow was deeper here, and I had to drive slowly, carefully. My heart was pounding in my chest in a way that seemed excessive, but I couldn't stop it. And then I saw it. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by pine trees with mountains rising up behind it. The building was wooden, old, with a slanted roof and a stone chimney. There was a front porch with rough-hewn beams, just like in Marcus's drawing. I pulled the car into the clearing and turned off the engine. For a long time, I just sat there. I sat there and looked at the cabin, and I thought about my brother. I thought about him coming here 26 years ago in the summer of 1998. I thought about him driving up this same road, parking his truck, walking up onto this porch, entering this building, looking for answers that never came. I got out of the car and walked to the door. It was locked, but it was an old lock, and the door was old, and when I pushed on it, it gave way. I went inside. The cabin was cold and dark. There was dust on everything. The furniture was covered with white sheets. There were old photos on the walls, not of Michael, but of the Coleman family from generations past. I moved through the rooms slowly, looking for some sign of my brother, but there was nothing to indicate that he'd ever been here. I found myself in a small bedroom in the back. There was a single bed, a window looking out toward the mountains, and on the nightstand, I don't know why this detail stands out so clearly in my memory, there was a paperback book. I picked it up. It was On the Road by Jack Kerouac, one of Michael's favorite books. The pages were water-damaged, the cover was falling off, and inside the front cover, in handwriting that I recognized from old letters, was written, Michael 1995. I held the book in my hands, and I wept. I don't know how long I stood there. Eventually, the light started to fade, the sun was setting behind the mountains, and I had to leave. I put the book on the shelf where I'd found it. I closed the door of the cabin behind me, though I left it unlocked, and I drove back down the mountain in the dark. I checked into the hotel in RA, and I called the rental company and told them I'd keep the car for another few days. I wasn't sure what I was going to do, but I knew I wasn't ready to leave yet. The next morning, I went to the library in RA and I looked through old newspaper archives. I searched for Michael's name, and I found a few articles from 1998, brief mentions of a search for a missing person in the area. The articles didn't say much. They mentioned that a man had gone missing from a rented cabin, that there was an ongoing search, that the situation was ongoing. And then the articles stopped. The search was called off, the man was presumed dead, and the newspaper moved on to other stories. I spent hours looking through old issues, trying to piece together what had happened, but the newspapers didn't have the full story. They didn't have the context of Michael's life, his struggles, his connections. They just had the bare facts of his absence. I drove back to the cabin a few more times over those next few days. I would sit there in the clearing, and I would try to imagine what Michael had been thinking, what he'd been feeling, what decision he'd made. Had he walked into the mountains with the intention of not coming back? Had he gotten lost? Had he just decided that the world was too complicated and he needed to step out of it? I would never know, and I realized, over those days in RA, that not knowing was something I was going to have to accept. On my last day there, I took the book, Michael's copy of On the Road, and I brought it back to my hotel. I packed it in my bag, and the next morning I got in the car and I drove back to Denver, and from Denver I drove back east toward home. Part 6, The Return. I didn't go back to my apartment in Manhattan. Instead, I drove to Sarah's house in Connecticut. It was late evening when I arrived, after dark. Sarah came to the door, and when she saw me, she looked frightened. "Dad," she said, "are you all right? Where have you been?" "I've been in Colorado," I said. "I found the cabin." She brought me inside and made me coffee, and I told her the entire story. I told her about finding Emma, about driving to the mountains, about discovering Michael's book in the cabin. I told her about sitting in the snow-covered clearing and understanding that my brother was gone, truly gone, and that the mystery of his disappearance was something that I would never fully solve. Sarah listened, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "Why didn't you tell me you were going?" she asked finally. "Because I needed to do it alone," I said. "Because I needed to understand what happened without anyone else's version of events." "And have you understood?" "No," I said, "but I've accepted that I don't understand, and that's something." The next day, Sarah called Marcus's school and told them he wouldn't be coming in. Then she told Todd that she was taking the day to spend with family, and she took me to meet Marcus properly. They brought him to the living room, and Sarah sat on one side of him and I sat on the other. For a long moment, none of us said anything. Then Sarah began to tell Marcus a story. She told him about his great-uncle Michael. She told him about Michael's life, his dreams, his struggles. She told him about the cabin in the mountains, about the book that Michael had loved. She told him that Michael had wanted to find answers, but that sometimes there are no clear answers. Sometimes there's just the acceptance that life is complicated and people are fragile, and sometimes we lose people we love. And as she was telling him this story, I watched Marcus's face. I watched as his expression shifted from blank acceptance to something more complex, recognition, maybe, or understanding, or the beginning of it. When Sarah finished, she pulled out her phone and showed Marcus the photo I'd taken of the cabin. She showed him the book that I'd brought back. She explained that the drawing he'd made, the drawing that had started all of this, was the same cabin that Michael had gone to. She explained that Michael was his great-uncle, and that sometimes people we don't know can touch our lives in unexpected ways. I don't know if Marcus understood all of it. I don't know if any of what we told him made sense to a 9-year-old boy who doesn't speak. But I watched as he reached out and touched the book, tracing his fingers over the spine, over the title. And very quietly, so quietly I almost didn't hear it, he made a sound. Not a word exactly, but not complete silence either. It was a small sound, something between a sigh and a whisper. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. That night, Sarah and I sat in her kitchen while Marcus slept, and we talked about what to do next. "I think we should tell him the truth," she said. "Not everything, he's still a child, but the basic truth that Michael existed, that he was part of our family, that he was lost. I think he has a right to know that." "I think you're right," I said. "And I think," Sarah continued, "that maybe we all need to stop pretending that Michael didn't exist. That maybe it's time to bring him back into the story of our family, not as a tragedy to be hidden, but as a life that mattered." Over the following weeks, Sarah did something she'd never done before. She reached out to other family members, to our Aunt Carol, to distant cousins, to people who'd known Michael years ago. She told them the real story, not the cleaned-up version, but the actual complicated truth. She said that Michael had been lost, and that they'd been carrying that loss in silence for too long, and that it was time to acknowledge it. Some people were angry. They felt like they'd been lied to over the years. But most people were sad and grateful and relieved to finally have the real story rather than the absence of one. I did something else. I went back to Michael's story and I tried to piece together a fuller picture. I tracked down some of Michael's old friends, people he'd known in high school and college. I talked to them about who he'd been. I started to collect the fragments of his life, a person who'd been real, who'd mattered, who'd struggled, who'd eventually been lost. And I made peace with the fact that Michael would never become who he wanted to be, that the reinvention he'd dreamed about would never happen. But I also made peace with his life as it had been lived, imperfect, complicated, trying. He'd existed. He'd mattered. That was enough. Part 7, Marcus Speaks. 3 months after I returned from Colorado, Marcus spoke his first word in 5 years. It happened on a day in March, when the snow was finally starting to melt and the world was thawing back toward life. I was at Sarah's house for dinner, something that had become a regular occurrence now. I came over every other Sunday, and we'd eat together, the four of us, and sometimes Jennifer when she was home from college. It had become something I looked forward to. Marcus was sitting at the table, drawing as he often did, while Sarah finished up the meal. Todd was in the living room watching the news. Jennifer was upstairs. I was helping Sarah with the salad, chopping tomatoes. And then Marcus did something he almost never did. He tapped on the table to get my attention. When I looked at him, he pointed to his drawing and slid it toward me. It was a picture of the cabin again, but this time it was different. It had a person in front of it, a figure that I immediately recognized as Michael. And next to Michael was another figure that could have been me, with gray hair and an older face. Sarah had noticed too, and she came over to look at the drawing. Marcus looked up at her and then at me, and his mouth opened. "Grandfather," he said. His voice was thin and uncertain, like something being used for the first time after a long period of disuse. "You found him." Sarah made a sound, half laugh, half sob, and she reached down and pulled Marcus into a hug. "I'm so glad you talked," she said into his hair. "I'm so glad." Marcus looked at me over his mother's shoulder, and his dark eyes were serious and clear. "He was sad," Marcus said, and it took me a moment to understand that he was talking about Michael. "The sad man, you found where he went to be sad." "Yes," I said, and I was aware that my voice was shaking. "That's right." "Is that why he didn't come back?" Marcus asked. "I think so," I said. "I think he went to the mountains because he was looking for something, or he was running from something, and he couldn't find his way back." Marcus nodded, as if this made sense to him in a way that it probably made sense to most of the world, but which had been forbidden to him until now. "I'm glad you found it," he said. "The place, I think he wanted someone to find it." And maybe he was right. Maybe, in some strange way, Michael had wanted to be found. Maybe the drawing he'd made and given to Lisa, maybe that drawing had been Michael's way of leaving a message. A map. A way of saying, "I was here, and this place mattered to me." Marcus spoke more regularly after that day. It was slow at first, his words came carefully, and there were still long periods of silence. But gradually, his voice became more present. Sarah took him to a speech therapist, who said that his mutism had been psychological rather than physical, and that the key to his recovery had been healing whatever had been damaged when Emma told him about Michael. Learning about Michael, about his grief and his loss, and his search for answers, had somehow given Marcus permission to speak his own grief, to acknowledge that the world was complicated and sad, and that sometimes people we don't know affect our lives in profound ways. Over the course of the spring, Marcus told me more about why he'd drawn the cabin. He said that after Emma showed him Michael's drawing, he'd started to dream about it. In his dreams, he'd been inside the cabin, looking out the window at the mountains. And in his dreams, there had been a man there, Michael, he understood now, and the man had been very sad, but also very peaceful, like he'd found what he'd been looking for even though it was the thing he didn't want to find. Marcus said that he couldn't talk about the dreams because they were too big and too scary, so his body had just decided to be quiet instead. But after he drew the picture and gave it to me, after I went to Colorado and found the actual cabin, something had shifted. The dreams had become less scary. They'd become more like memories, even though they were memories of places he'd never been and people he'd never met. "I think," Marcus told me one afternoon in April, we were sitting on Sarah's back porch. "I think he sent the dream to me so someone would find him, so he wouldn't be forgotten." "I think you might be right," I said. And I realized, sitting there with my grandson, that Marcus had been the key to this whole story all along. That somehow, through his mute intuition and his ability to see connections that the rest of us had missed, he had brought Michael back into our family. He had pulled us out of the silence and made us acknowledge what we'd been trying to forget. Part 8, Resolution. By the summer of that year, things had settled into a new pattern. Marcus was speaking regularly now, though he was still a quieter child than most. He'd made friends at school. He was doing well in his classes. The therapist said he was healing beautifully, that his silence had been a kind of protective mechanism that had served its purpose and then been discarded. I had made changes in my own life too. I'd quit my job at the accounting firm where I'd worked for 30 years. I'd sold my apartment in Manhattan and I'd moved into a small house in the Hudson Valley, about an hour from Sarah's place in Connecticut. It had a kitchen and a living room and a study, and I'd set up the study with a desk where I could write. Because I had decided to write about Michael, I'd decided to document what I'd learned, the fragments of his life, the story of how he'd been lost and what it meant to find him again. I wanted to create something that would preserve him, something that would make him real, not just as the person who disappeared, but as the person who had lived. I spent hours in that study, writing by hand, filling up notebook after notebook with the story of my brother. Some days the writing came easily, and some days it felt like pulling teeth. But I kept at it because I felt like it was the last thing I could do for Michael, the only way I could repay the debt of having chosen safety while he chose risk. Todd, surprisingly, became a source of support during this time. He reached out to me one day and told me that he'd been thinking about everything that had happened and that he wanted to help. He offered to hire a private investigator to look into Michael's disappearance, to see if there was any new information that might have come to light over the years. I was skeptical, but I gave it a try, and what came back was both surprising and not surprising at all. The investigator found that a body had been recovered in the San Juan Mountains in the fall of 1998, about 2 months after Michael disappeared. The body had been unidentified because it was in an advanced state of decomposition and had no identifying features. It had been buried in the county cemetery as unknown male, and no one had ever claimed it. The timeline matched, the location matched. The investigator thought it was very likely that the body was Michael, but there was no way to know for certain without DNA evidence, which would require exhuming the body. I had to make a decision. Did I want to know? Did I want to confirm that Michael was dead, that his body had been in that cemetery for 26 years, while my family thought he'd simply vanished? I thought about it for a long time, and in the end, I decided that I didn't need the confirmation. I'd already found Michael in the cabin, in the book, in the drawing that Marcus had made. I'd already grieved him. Whether his body was in that cemetery or whether he'd walked off into the wilderness and started a new life somewhere else, I didn't think it mattered anymore. What mattered was that I had acknowledged his existence, that I had brought him back into the conversation, that I had honored the life he'd lived. So I decided to let him rest wherever he was. Sarah and I talked about it, and she agreed. We told Todd not to proceed with the exhumation, and we made a decision to do something else instead. We held a memorial service. It was a small affair, just family. My Aunt Carol came and Jennifer and Todd's parents who'd made the drive from their home in Massachusetts. We held it on a sunny day in June at a church in Connecticut. I gave a eulogy about Michael, about who he had been, about his dreams, about his struggles. I talked about the fact that he had been lost, but that he had mattered, that his life had had an impact, even though he'd been taken from us too soon. I read passages from his favorite book, On the Road, the same book that had been sitting in the cabin all those years. And I introduced Emma to our family. I had invited her to come, and she had agreed. She sat in the church during the service, and she listened to me talk about the brother she'd only known for a week. And afterward, she was surrounded by family members who wanted to know her, who wanted to understand this piece of Michael that had survived, that had grown up and become a woman and a teacher and a person in her own right. It was healing, I think, for all of us. It was a way of finally saying goodbye to Michael, but also of saying hello to the possibility of acknowledging his place in our lives. After the service, we went back to Sarah's house and we had a gathering. People sat around and told stories about Michael. Some of them were funny, some of them were sad. My Aunt Carol talked about Michael as a child, about how he used to perform for anyone who would watch, how he'd always been the kind of kid who wanted to be seen. And Marcus sat quietly in the corner, listening to these stories, understanding them in a way that none of the rest of us could understand them, because he had been the one who had first brought Michael back from the dead. That night, after everyone had left, I found myself alone with Marcus in Sarah's backyard. He was sitting on the grass, looking up at the stars that were just starting to appear in the darkening sky. "Do you think he's happy now?" Marcus asked. I said, sitting down beside him, "that Michael is at peace wherever he is." "That's what I dream," Marcus said. "I dream that he's in the cabin and he's peaceful and he's not sad anymore." "That sounds like a good dream," I said. "It is," Marcus said. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "I'm glad you found him. I'm glad you went and looked for him." "I'm glad you showed me where to look," I said. Part 9, The Beginning. In the fall of that year, I published a chapbook about Michael. It was self-published, just a small run of 100 copies. It contained the story of his life, as much as I could piece together, and the story of how I'd found him. I gave copies to family members, and I sent one to Emma, and I sent one to the library in Ouray, Colorado, where a librarian might someday come across it and understand that Michael wasn't just a name in a missing persons report, but a life that had been lived. I also gave a copy to Marcus, and he read it carefully, and when he was done, he asked me if he could have more copies to give to his friends. I made him 50 more, and he handed them out at school, and his friends read about the great uncle he'd never met, and the mountain cabin, and the mystery of loss and connection, and how families hold their secrets. One day in November, Marcus came to me with a new drawing. It was still the cabin, but now it had changed. The cabin was larger, and there were more people around it. There was Michael, and there was me, and there was Sarah, and there was Emma, and there was Marcus himself. They were all standing together in front of the cabin, and above them, the sun was rising. "What is this?" I asked him. "It's the happy version," Marcus said. "The version where everyone is together and no one is sad anymore." I held the drawing for a long time, and I understood what he was trying to say. He was trying to say that even though Michael was gone, even though we'd lost him and couldn't get him back, we were still connected. We were still a family. The loss hadn't destroyed us, it had brought us closer. In December, Sarah asked me if I wanted to spend Christmas at her house again. I said yes immediately. This time I came early and I stayed for a week. We decorated the tree together and Marcus helped, carefully hanging ornaments on the branches. I cooked with Sarah in the kitchen. I played board games with Marcus. I sat by the fire with Todd, and we talked about nothing in particular. On Christmas Eve, Sarah told me something. She said that she'd been thinking about Michael for a long time, about how his story had been hidden, and she'd decided to do something about it. She'd contacted a documentary filmmaker, someone she knew professionally, and she'd told her about Michael, about his disappearance, about what we'd discovered, about how Marcus had brought him back into our story. The filmmaker was interested. She wanted to create something, not a documentary exactly, but a short film about loss and memory and how families hold on to their dead even when they've tried to let them go. "Would you be willing to participate?" Sarah asked. I said yes, and I realized, as I said it, that I'd been waiting for permission to tell this story all along. I'd been waiting for someone to tell me that it was okay to stop pretending that Michael had never existed. I'd been waiting for my family to decide, collectively, that the truth was more important than the secret. Part 10, The Healing. Over the next year, things shifted in ways that I couldn't have predicted. The documentary filmmaker, a woman named Rebecca, which felt like a small cosmic joke, spent months interviewing me and Sarah and Marcus and Emma. She retraced some of Michael's steps, she visited the cabin, she interviewed the people in Ouray who remembered the search. What emerged was a portrait of a young man who had been loved and lost, but whose life had continued to ripple outward in unexpected ways. A man whose death or disappearance had, when finally acknowledged, become a kind of bridge between different parts of a fractured family. Marcus seemed to thrive with the attention in his quiet way. He spoke more freely in the interviews, talking about his dreams and his understanding of Michael and what it meant to be connected to someone through nothing but mystery and intuition. He was articulate and thoughtful, and I could see the filmmaker becoming more and more moved by his perspective. Sarah began to research Michael's life more deeply. She tracked down people he'd known in high school and college. She read through old letters that we'd stored away in boxes. She created a kind of biography, not just of Michael's death, but of Michael's life. I continued to write. I finished the longer manuscript about Michael, about my journey to Colorado, about the process of grieving someone who had been lost in such a permanent way. I sent it to publishers, and it was rejected several times, and then finally one small press agreed to publish it. The book came out the following spring, and to my surprise, people read it. People who'd lost family members in similar ways reached out to me. People who understood the weight of unsolved mysteries and unfinished stories found something of themselves in my description of learning to live with absence. Emma published her own piece, an essay about being the unexpected heir to Michael's legacy, about the burden and gift of being the biological connection to a family she'd never chosen, but who had chosen, eventually, to embrace her. But the most important change happened with Marcus. Over the course of that year, Marcus evolved from a quiet, frightened child into a thoughtful, articulate young man. He continued to draw, but he drew other things now, not just the cabin, but landscapes, faces, scenes from his imagination. He started to think about art school, about becoming a teacher or an artist or something that involved helping other people express what was inside them. And he became the keeper of Michael's story for our family. He would tell people about his great-uncle. He would explain the mystery of the cabin, the search that had happened decades before he was born, the way that intuition and dream logic had brought a lost relative back into our consciousness. He would do it without bitterness or sadness, but with a kind of acceptance that felt hard-won, as if he understood that the world contained both loss and connection, and that both of those things were necessary. Part 11, The Storm. In the winter of 2026, I was 75 years old, and Michael had been gone for 28 years. The world had changed enormously, and yet some things remained the same. Sarah's children had grown, Jennifer was now working in finance like her father, and Marcus was a sophomore in high school, a beautiful, articulate young man who still carried the mystery of Michael with him like a secret language that only he could fully speak. I had relocated permanently to the Hudson Valley. I'd written 2 more books. I'd given several talks about grief and loss and the stories we tell ourselves about the people we've loved. I'd become something of a voice for people who were trying to understand their own mysteries. That winter was particularly harsh. There was a lot of snow, and one night in January, a massive storm rolled through. The power went out, and the county declared a state of emergency. I was in my house, staying warm by a wood-burning stove, when the call came from Sarah. "It's Marcus," she said, and her voice was strange. "He's at the hospital." Marcus had been driving home from a friend's house when the storm got worse. He'd pulled off the road, trying to wait it out, and another car had hit him. He was okay. He had some bruises, a mild concussion, but he was okay. I drove to the hospital, carefully through the snow, and I found Sarah and Todd in the waiting room. We sat together, all 3 of us, and we didn't say much. Sarah held my hand. Marcus was released after 24 hours, with instructions to rest and avoid strenuous activity. I drove back to the hospital the next day and picked him up. Driving back, he was quiet, which was unusual for him now. Usually he was talkative, eager to share his thoughts and feelings and observations about the world. "Are you okay?" I asked him. "I think I saw Michael," he said. I didn't respond immediately. I kept my eyes on the road. "In the accident," Marcus continued, "when the car hit me when I was spinning, I saw him. I saw Michael. He was sitting in the passenger seat." "What did he look like?" I asked. "Like the photographs," Marcus said. "Like a younger version of you, and he was. He was telling me something, but I couldn't hear him over the sound of the crash." "What do you think he was telling you?" Marcus was quiet for a long time. "I think," he said finally, "I think he was telling me that it's okay, that he's at peace, and that I can let him rest now, that I don't have to carry his story so heavily anymore." I didn't know what to say to that. So I just drove, and I held the steering wheel steady, and I let my grandson sit with whatever vision or dream or manifestation of his great-uncle he'd encountered. When I dropped him off at his house, Sarah was waiting on the porch, looking frantic. She pulled him into a hug and held him tightly. "I was so scared," she said, into his shoulder. "It's okay, Mom," Marcus said. "Everything's okay, I understand now." Epilogue, 5 years later. I'm 80 now, Marcus is 23, and he's a junior in college, studying art and psychology. He's exploring the intersection between creative expression and mental health, which feels like a natural evolution of his own journey. Sarah's hair is completely gray now, and she's thinking about retirement. Todd is the same, still steady, still reliable, still the anchor that keeps their family grounded. I've written 5 books now. The first one about Michael became something of a quiet success. It found its audience among people who were struggling with loss and grief and the complications of family. I do talks and workshops. I've helped a few people find missing relatives. I've become, in a quiet way, someone who helps people live with the mysteries that won't be solved. Emma is married now. She has a daughter, and she named her Michael after his great uncle. She comes to family gatherings, and we've built something real, not the bond of blood exactly, but the bond of shared history and shared loss. And the cabin is still standing out in the Colorado mountains. I go there every year. I spend a few days there, alone, and I sit in that small bedroom where Michael's book was left, and I think about the life he lived and the life he didn't get to live. I've made peace with not knowing exactly what happened to him. I've made peace with the mystery. The fact that his body was likely in that cemetery, that he probably chose to end his life rather than continue living with the pain, is something I've accepted, but I don't dwell on it. What matters is that he lived. What matters is that he mattered. What matters is that his great-nephew, a boy who couldn't speak, somehow knew him anyway, through dreams and intuition and the strange connections that bind families together across time and death and silence. Marcus speaks freely now. He's articulate and thoughtful. He's written about Michael for his college applications, about grief and connection, and the way that love can transcend biological relationship. He's created art about the cabin, paintings and drawings, and even a sculpture, a physical representation of the place that brought us all back together. Sarah told me a few years ago that she'd stopped feeling guilty about keeping the secret for so long. She said that she understood now why she'd done it. She'd been trying to protect me from pain, the way you protect your children from things that might hurt them. But she said that in the end, the truth was less painful than the silence. I asked her if she'd do it differently, if she could go back. "I don't know," she said. "Maybe the secret had to exist for a while. Maybe you all had to get to a certain place before you could handle the truth." Looking back on all of it now, I think that's probably right. This story didn't end with my finding Michael. It didn't end with the memorial service or the book or the documentary. It's still ongoing. It's in the way that Marcus paints, in the way that Sarah talks about her family, in the way that Emma honors the half-brother she never had by building a life of meaning and connection. It's in the way that I, who once chose safety and silence and the protection of not knowing, have learned to embrace complexity and mystery and the truth of who we are. It's in the drawings that Marcus still makes sometimes, not the cabin anymore, but landscapes and faces, art that explores the interior worlds that can't be spoken aloud. Michael went to the mountains looking for answers, and he didn't come back. But in his absence, he taught us something about presence. In his disappearance, he showed us how to be found. And that, I think, is the truest ending I can offer, not a neat resolution where everything is explained, but an acknowledgement that some mysteries remain mysteries, and that's okay. What matters is the love that's created in the searching. What matters is the family that's built in the telling of the story. What matters is that he was here. The final memory. Last spring, I took Marcus back to Colorado. We drove out together, just the two of us, and we went to the cabin. It was spring, and the mountains were emerging from the snow, the world thawing back to life. Marcus stood in front of the cabin for a long time, just looking at it. Then he went inside, and I followed him. We went into the small bedroom where I'd found Michael's book, but this time the room was empty. I'd taken the book years ago. It sits on a shelf in my study now. Marcus sat on the bed and he was quiet. I didn't push him to speak, I just sat with him. After a while he said, I think he found peace. I think when he came here, he finally found what he was looking for. What was he looking for? I asked. Marcus thought about it. Quiet, he said finally. He was looking for a place where he could just be quiet, where he didn't have to be anything for anyone else. And he found it, in the mountains, even if he found it at the end. I put my arm around my grandson, and we sat there together in the cabin that had started everything, the cabin that a mute boy had drawn on Christmas Day, the cabin that had brought my lost brother back into our lives. And I understood, finally, what Michael had been seeking all along. Not answers exactly, not a new version of himself, just a place where the noise of the world stopped and he could finally rest. I hoped he'd found it. I think, in the end, he did.